So anyway, welcome. We've got some new faces here today, as well as some repeat visitors, which is all wonderful. Welcome to our lunch seminar of the month. We have Professors Chris Wells, Michelle Anderson are going to be our featured presenters today. This is a forum where we like to have kind of these are research projects that are work in progress. We're welcoming feedback from academics on campus and from industry participants online. You guys prefer if questions are held to the end, or if they interrupt any?
Yeah, fine to interrupt. If we want to leave until the end, we'll just say that. So
sure, great. Anyway, I will turn it over to them. So it's not you have any more time. And
thanks. We're going to do a couple of hand-ups here. So I'm Chris Wells from College of Communication, and I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the bigger project that this native advertising research is a part of. So we are actually this native advertising project is part of a larger project that's sponsored by the folks you see here at the Institute for Global Sustainability, the Hariri Center. The native advertising work is also supported by IMAP. So thank you, Susan and IMAP, for your support of that work. Let me just say a word about our bigger project. This is part of a piece of work going on that's looking at disinformation and climate change. And we've got three major components of this project, of which the native advertising is one. These are some of the folks involved in the whole project. I saw Sarah Finney-Robinson on Zoom a second ago, and I think Irina is on her way here. But today we're going to focus on the native advertising specifically. Michelle? Is that all? Yeah, I'm going to turn over to Michelle, who's an international expert on native advertising.
Thanks, Chris, and thank you all for joining us. So just to preface what native advertising is, you may have heard of it. It's referred to by different things, but it's a form of camouflage. It is when commercial content is camouflaged as something else. In our case, we're looking at it when it is camouflaged as editorial news content. And so this is an example of what native advertising looks like in mainstream news sites. So you can see the masthead at the top. This is from the Washington Post. And if you scroll down, you'll see that there is an article about, what did it say? Cooling the planet. So an obvious link to climate language. And if you look closely in the upper left-hand corner, there is a disclosure that says content from Opteon. Okay, Opteon is a chemicals company, and they actually purchased this. This is an ad that looks like an article in the Washington Post. So all of the national news outlets are doing this, not just in the United States, globally. It is a way to generate revenue. The newspaper industry has experienced a significant loss of advertising over the last 20 years or so. And this is one way that they are seeking to reclaim some of that revenue. The part of the appeal of this is that it's not interruptive. It seems like authentic information. It's problematic though, because it's commercial information. That's not to say that commercial information can't be accurate, but nonetheless, many people don't understand what they're looking at. So we see here again, there is the disclosure. It was created by the Washington Post's WP Brand Studio. So most of the national news organizations have created in-house content studios. These are like advertising agencies within the news organizations. So no longer is this being created externally by BBDO or other large advertising agencies. It's being created in-house in the news organizations by their custom content studios. So this is the specific type of native advertising that we are looking at. And over the last, since 2014 or so, I have been looking at how audiences receive this information. How do they respond to it? And over again, I have found, as well as many other scholars who look at this, we've found that most people don't recognize what they're looking at as commercial content, right? The disclosures are there. There's no standardization as to what the disclosures have to say, which is one problem. But most of the time, the disclosures are there. Significant proportions of the public do not understand that this is paid content. It's commercial. So, as I said, what's different about this from the advertorials of yesteryear is that it is the news organizations that are creating this content. So here's the New York Times. Their in-house content studio is called T-Brand Studio. And this is their pitch to potential companies who want to work with them. We'll be your storyteller, and we'll do it in the fashion associated with New York Times reporting, right? So it will seem like it's a New York Times article. We craft award-winning multimedia branded storytelling about interesting people, incredible places, and inspirational ideas of today. So while I said that this content is disclosed on their publisher websites, there's the disclosures that aren't standardized. New York Times often uses paid posts. Washington Post has content by, it varies. The Federal Trade Commission requires the disclosures, but doesn't say what language they need to use. So this is on the publisher websites. Now, of course, in today's technological age, part of the appeal of creating content is that it can be shared. And many of the agreements made between content studios and external clients is that the content studio will amplify this content, right? And so one can, it sees the news article from ExxonMobil, one can share it. And so this is me sharing that Option article on social media. This is Twitter here. Now, the disclosures are supposed to stay with the content. But what we see here, I'm sharing this, it looks like an article from the Washington Post. There is no disclosure saying that this is sponsored content or native advertising. This is a violation of the FTC Act. And this is so I published on this half the time when this content is shared on Twitter, the disclosures disappear. Similar research has been done on Facebook. Half the time, the disclosures disappear. It's actually more than half the time, a little more. This is what it's supposed to look like. So this is from the New York Times. This is actually an ExxonMobil native ad. But you can see here, when I share it, it says paid post. Now, you may not know what paid post means. I'm telling you it means it's an ad, but it does state. There is a disclosure there in two places. An auto-filled comment up here, and then this is the Twitter card. So you can see paid posts there. That's what's supposed to happen. Now, continuing on with legalities, our former state attorney general, Maura Healey, sued ExxonMobil in 2019 for misleading Massachusetts consumers as well as investors about what ExxonMobil's products are doing to the climate. One of the exhibits in this lawsuit is this native ad that ran in the New York Times It is disclosed. You see the paid post disclosure there. I think I have a little box that I've added to it. Yeah. So you can see it a little bit more easily in the center there. And if you scroll down, it's an article about their efforts to find renewable fuels, in this case, algae. Chris will be talking more about that when we get into the results of our study. So just a couple other points before we get into our study. Some of my other research has looked at, well, what happens after companies pay for native advertising in mainstream news outlets? So I looked at, along with one of my collaborators, I looked at 5 years worth of native ads from 26 corporations that ran in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal. And what we found was that across those 5 years, half the time after a native ad ran, there was significantly less authentic news reporting about that corporation. So in other words, the news outlet holds back on their reporting on that corporation that ran the native ad. So this seems concerning. It raises questions about the journalistic independence that we expect. So one of the things we're going to try and do in our current study is see, is this something that continues with fossil fuel companies? I'll point out here, this was a Wells Fargo native ad. I think I'm sharing it on LinkedIn here. Again, no disclosures. It looks like a Washington Post article. So to sum up about native advertising, it has been shown to deceive audiences because of the labeling issue. The labels, the disclosures often disappear when shared on social media. And there's questions about it harming journalistic integrity. My studies have shown that after people are exposed to native advertising content, they have significantly lower perceptions of real news content. There's evidence that what's being said in the native ads contradicts what the real news reporting is. I just talked about how there's evidence that native advertising suppresses future news reporting. And the other thing is we all have a finite amount of attention to give. If we're looking at advertising without realizing it, we're not looking at news, right? And when that choice is taken away from us because it's mislabeled or not labeled, it's creating a competing agenda for our attention. So what we decided to do in this project is look at native ads, specifically native ads that are invoking climate claims. We're looking at fossil fuel companies that are doing this. Why? So we can look at what are they saying? What are their narratives? How are they trying to shape the conversation? How are they trying to shape people's perceptions? So a few of the research questions that we're trying to answer with this project is, which corporations are using native advertising to communicate about sustainability and or climate change? How extensive are these campaigns? What are the themes and narratives in these campaigns? And then to what extent are these claims accurate? So just to get us started about how we've been doing this, we looked at the top 50 most visited news websites in the US, according to Press Gazette, which is an industry reporting group in the UK. And we found that about half of them have in-house content studios. So those are the ones we care about. We're not concerned with the ones that use Taboola or Outbrain to bring in native ads. We're concerned with those that are creating it in-house. So about half of this 50, 26 of them had in-house content studios. A few of them that we looked through were more difficult to ascertain what was or wasn't. So we dropped them. We wound up with, our sample includes these 22 news organizations in our sample. And
Michelle, is there any major news outlet that doesn't do this? This looks pretty comprehensive, just scanning through the list. Is there any one that doesn't do it?
Yeah.
Was it
For
CBS?
CBS, I think.
CBS, yeah, we didn't have a reliable way to find some of them, and that was the problem. Chris is going to go over what methods we used. Not only is there no standardization in terms of disclosure to consumers, each of these 22 news outlets have different ways that they market on their site. Some of them don't even market in their URLs, so it's very hard to find at scale all these articles. So I'm going to turn it over to Chris now to talk about what our methodology was.
All right, cool. Thanks, Michelle. So let me say a couple words about disinformation first, because this is a study of climate dis and misinformation. And the earlier question was really good about whether this is deceptive advertising or what its nature is. So I want to distinguish two things. One is sort of the nature of what native advertising is. And in communication, going back to Jürgen Habermas, there's been this distinction between advertising and public relations as forms of communication that companies, people involved in the market engage in. Where advertising is advertising where you are clearly selling something. You're clearly putting a message out there because you want some kind of benefit to your company. Public relations is a little more subtle. It's where you want to shape the public conversation. So it's not necessarily about your company or your bottom line, but you want to shape perceptions of something, maybe an issue, maybe yourself. So this is kind of a conceptual distinction. If we think about native advertising, if you want to advertise your product, native advertising may not be the place you want to do it because it's expensive. You've got to do this thing. You may be advertising your product somewhere else. But native advertising looks like a prime place where you may engage in what I just called public relations, where you want to shape perceptions of something. It's good because a lot of the time, as Michelle just pointed out, the public isn't aware of what type of content they're seeing. It looks to them like it's coming from a news organization and it's part of sort of a larger public dialogue, in which case you might have more of an opportunity to get people's ears who would interpret your message differently if it was clear to them that it was advertising. So that's one issue. I'm going to set that aside. The second question about whether it's deceptive is what we're really focused on here. What I'm going to be showing you is the content of this native advertising that we're currently analyzing. And I'm really curious about your feedback, this being a work in progress, in terms of how you would think about the kinds of claims being made by these companies. And in particular, the relationship between those claims and other aspects of their business operations, which, as we'll see, is a really big issue when you see how they're advertising themselves in native advertising, as opposed to the way their businesses actually operate, which is really the basis of Maura Healey's suit against Exxon. But let me start by telling you a little bit more about just the data. I'll go through this fairly rapidly, but I'm happy to stop if people are interested in more details. So Michelle just showed the 22 news organizations. There's a whole bunch of different customizations that are necessary on each of these pages in order to gather data from them. It's super inconvenient for us. So we essentially wrote distinct searches using Google's sort of advanced search interface, referred to as Google Dork, to combine signals of native advertising from the sites, whether it appeared in the HTML or the URL or something else, with one of 77 keywords that were used. So the keywords were the same for every site. The distinct signals from the site were sort of separate. And that gave us this large data set. We wrote Python Spherips to do this. We have something like 27,000 records. We don't have that many native ads about climate pollution and energy. It's a bit of an oversample, which we're currently pruning right now. So we sort of cast a wide net and now we're selecting the data that we really want. there's a lot of different advertisers in here. I'm going to focus on fossil fuel companies right now, but we've got a large presence of tech companies. Huawei, for example, is in there. Other tech companies promoting their green credentials, green energy companies, and then finance companies play a big role as well. So these are the companies. Just what I'm going to show you today. I took some of the top fossil fuel companies. We scanned them for whether they have native campaigns in our data set. The ones on the left do, the ones on the right we haven't found any of. So these are the ones I'm going to show you. I'm just going to show you sort of an illustration of our data and very preliminary kind of summary conclusions about what we're seeing. We're in the process of quantitative analysis of the data now, but I'm very curious about your feedback, your understanding about other things that may be going on in the industry that may be behind these kinds of communications, and so on. We'll start with BP. I'll show you 3 or 4 companies worth. First, a summary. Earlier in our data, which starts around 2014, you see a heavy emphasis on technology and safety. This is following the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So understandably, they're emphasizing those themes, less so other environmental issues. They had campaigns in the Atlantic and Politico that we've detected. A little bit later, we saw a discussion of what they called a dual energy challenge. They had a big spreads in CNN with separate campaigns oriented to the UK, the US, and India. They all have kind of the same format, but they are somewhat customized to each country, which they talk about the dual energy challenge. I'll show you an illustration of that in a second. More recently, they've talked about the energy trilemma. So they've found a third challenge. And this is this year, or last year, July and August of 2022. They've got kind of this podcast series on NewYorkTimes.com that you can go and listen to these interviews about the energy trilemma, by which they refer to the reliability of energy, the affordability of energy, and then the sustainability of energy. So let me show you what this looks like. This is one of their early pieces. This one's in the Atlantic. It also ran in Politico. And you can see they're talking about safety here. The energy industry is constantly challenged by environmental uncertainties and weather conditions. Technology is helping keeping our workers safe. And this is, of course, just the headline. There's then an article that, again, looks like an Atlantic article talking about the great innovations that BP is making in providing safety for their workers. This one is from the US version of that dual energy challenge that I just referred to. One of their themes in that, and this is long, high production quality web page with a lot of discussion, a lot of citations about what's going on in energy. One of their big themes is about how much better natural gas is than coal in terms of, you see the big 50% reduction in emissions of using natural gas for electricity as opposed to coal. Then we move on to the energy trilemma. So this is, again, New York Times. You see the masthead, you see the paid post. This is a 6-episode podcast series hosted by Linda Yu, who interviews people like the CEO of BP and some of BP's partners in talking about how BP is helping to overcome these challenges. Moving on to Exxon. Huge campaign in the Times of algae-based fuels and cellulosic biomass, which Michelle just referred to. I'll talk about that in a second. They also talk about renewable diesel, carbon capture, and hydrogen technologies. So in general, Exxon has a lot of emphasis on promoting itself as not just a fossil fuel company, also investing in these alternate streams, and then also technologies that could allow us to continue to burn fossil fuels, such as using carbon capture or what they call renewable diesel. Interestingly, of all of our fossil fuel companies, we don't see a lot of discussion of policy in the native ads, but from Exxon we do. In fact, this past year, they published a piece in the Washington Post that included some of their policy preferences as the Washington Post. Okay, so this one is significant from the standpoint of disinformation, misinformation, or misleading content. This is the ad that Michelle just referred to, ran in the New York Times in 2019, 2018, 2019. It's the one also cited by Maura Healey in her lawsuit. The important fact here is that this is a big campaign, multimedia campaign. It's in native advertising, but it was also in paid advertising. There were 30-second spots for this. There are YouTube commercials for this. You can still find them, although I looked today and they are starting to be taken down. And all kinds of different stuff, emphasizing that ExxonMobil was investing a lot of money in the science of algae, basically growing algae in big ponds that you could then break down into biofuel so that you wouldn't have to burn fossil fuels. So here's a couple videos nicely produced for this series. This is one of the YouTube videos. There's actually a whole series of, it's called School of Exxon. It looks like it's for children in some ways. It's this nice scientist who talks about the science that ExxonMobil is producing. So to go back really quickly, the lawsuit from the Massachusetts Attorney General is about essentially defrauding investors and consumers by misleading the consumers about what Exxon was actually investing in. Maura Healey's claim is that consumers could realistically be misled into believing that a significant portion of ExxonMobil's business was investing in these kinds of green biofuels, when in reality, a tiny portion of their investments were into algae and the other renewable sources. So that's the case that the Massachusetts Attorney General is making. As Michelle just mentioned, indeed, just this week, ExxonMobil announced that they would no longer pursue research on algae-based fuels at all. So in a sense, the promises that they were making that we could eventually run fleets of trucks and airplanes on the fuel was misleading. If Exxon ever had the intention of actually scaling up these technologies, they didn't follow through on it. And at the very least, they were misleading people when most scientists said that algae-based fuels were never going to be able to produce the amount of energy that Exxon was promising that they would be able to produce. So one of the questions that we are grappling with at this point is, how do we think about content like this? It's factually correct. Exxon made investments in algae fuels, for example. On the other hand, in anything like wider context, it's deeply misleading in terms of the amount they were advertising about their investments in algae fuels as against their investments in oil and gas exploration, which, according to Bill McKibben, are in the order of $150 million a week, whereas that's sort of like the entire funding of this scientific campaign. So that's something that we are in the midst of thinking about, and we welcome feedback on. I'll just show a couple of other things. This is Exxon post in Wall Street Journal Business on renewable diesel. And you can see this one actually doesn't have a disclosure. There's no paid buy, but you can see the byline is by ExxonMobil, as if it were a order for the journal. Carbon capture, I mentioned, was a big theme. This one's in the Washington Post. This is a little bit more, again, high production quality. This is from the Post article that I just mentioned. And then this is the policy-focused native ad, which is really interesting. I'm just going to mention the policies that they promote here. An economy-wide price on carbon they promote. This is a little bit contentious, again, within the carbon in the ExxonMobil community, because Exxon has actually been promoting a price on carbon for a while. They supposedly want carbon to be priced so that it can be factored into market considerations. At the same time, documents were retrieved 10 years ago or so where Exxon executives were saying that it was safe to promote this line because it was never going to happen politically. So there's question about whether Exxon is genuinely promoting this. A technology neutral approach, by which they mean they don't want fossil fuels to be disadvantaged in future energy investments. And then a predictable policy landscape, which is a bit vague, but they're basically saying that they don't want anything to move too quickly. I'll just add a couple more ads because we've got a lot to talk about. Chevron has had a couple different ads. Chevron is a little bit different because they have more of a human touch in their ads early in our series. They showed a lot of discussion of revitalizing Appalachia with the shale gas revolution. So there's a lot of really human interest stories about someone who runs a hotel in rural Pennsylvania, and it's been revitalized by workers coming to work in those areas for the shale gas. They also promote STEM education for girls and for people in rural areas. This is the older stuff. This is mostly from 2014. More recently, we've found interactive ads in the Times promoting the idea of hybrid energy, energy needs, and the value of natural gas. So here we see a big emphasis on kind of reminding consumers that, hey, you kind of need us as fossil fuel companies because you rely on high levels of energy to increase your standard of living. So there are just a couple examples of that. This is a series that Chevron did on women in STEM. Interestingly, there's not a lot about Chevron in this. It's just sort of promoting a female scientist going about her day in the lab or something like that. So it's advertising by association is what's going on here. Abundant energy is fueling US growth, so attaching their products to economic growth and so on. I'm going to skip over total energy in the interest of time and just summarize for you. First, from our climate disinformation study perspective, it's interesting that we don't find any skepticism about the science of climate change. There's no questioning the greenhouse effect or other things in the data that we've looked at so far. It's not part of the current conversation from the fossil fuel companies, which is completely consistent with what other people have already written about the shift in those industries away from talking about climate change itself to instead presenting themselves as part of the solution to climate change, which is indeed what we do see. So we see companies talking about their innovations in low or zero carbon technologies like the carbon capture of ExxonMobil, for example, as well as the advantage of gas as a better fuel than coal in terms of carbon emissions. And emphasizing the energy needs that I just mentioned with respect to Chevron and that we see in the energy trilemma that BP is trying to make happen. And also the idea of hybridity, that we need all these different kinds of energy. Exxon calls this the technology neutral approach and so on. And finally, contributions to communities, whether it's rural Appalachia that's gaining from jobs or women in STEM that are in some way benefiting from Chevron and so forth. So currently, we have hundreds of campaigns, dozens of companies in our data. We're cleaning and organizing them. We also are looking forward, as Michelle mentioned, to on the journalism side, what impacts does accepting native ads from a company possibly have on coverage of them later? And also their spread on social media. So let me leave it there, but reiterate the kind of question that we're grappling with. In most of the content that we're seeing here, we don't have outright lies. This is not like 4chan or Reddit, where people are just making up stuff or promoting real conspiracy theories about the science of climate. At the same time, it's fair to say that a good portion of what we're seeing is misrepresentations. It's presenting ExxonMobil as something other than what it is, at least according to the Attorney General. It's promoting natural gas as a potentially alternative fuel, which with respect to coal, it is an alternative fuel, but the science of climate is pretty clear that we need to get off burning hydrocarbons altogether. So it's not a viable endpoint. So if you can help us think through how people in business would think about misinformation, about misleading claims, and how those would be adjudicated in sort of what senses and what frameworks there are for thinking about different levels of misleadingness, that would be valuable to us. Thank you.